Hello, this is Philip Williams with another lecture on Noah's Ark and Scripture science. Um, Now, this uh, particular lecture I think you'll find very interesting. It's how the title is How the Evidence of Noah's Flood Was Reimagined as Glacier Deposits from a Newly Invented Ice Age. Now, here you see a classic drawing or painting of the Ice Age. Um, uh, uh, but right off the bat, a little bit of critical thinking might see a problem here. Of course, I guess the snow on the ground indicates a colder ice age, but actually they're not supposed to be snow, but actually should be glaciers, like in Greenland and Antarctica, covering the land. And they're giant animals? How could they have had anything to eat if the ground is covered by glaciers? So, and of course, these are the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, saber-toothed tiger, uh, and these disappeared. Actually, they disappeared because of the flood, but it's currently thought that they disappeared gradually during the Ice Age. Now, this is also, of course, happens to be the subtitle of my book, Understanding the Recent Discovery of Noah's Ark, which was how the evidence of the flood got reimagined as a long ice age. Now, the last lecture, I introduced, the familiar geological column. This is accepted by both mainstream geologists and creationists. Now, they interpret the time, the younger creationists interpret this differently, but the geological column here, you see at the top the Holocene, the recent period that we live in now, and then right beneath that is an era called the Pleistocene, which is what is also referred to as the Ice Age. And the founders of geological science actually recognized these deposits, which now define the Ice Age, as flood deposits. That was the only way they could explain these. Now, these are not the deposits that the younger creationists claim as flood deposits. In fact, the creationists accept the theory of the Ice Age, which is actually where the true evidence of the flood are to be found. Now, these were, as I mentioned in the last lecture, the founders of geology who established this geological column also discovered what they referred to as the diluvium, or in fact, William Buckland identified the diluvium. All of them agreed it was probably a worldwide flood, and William Buckland, who I'll be talking about a little bit later, also identified this with Noah's flood of the Bible. And the evidence they had that they believed in this flood were these deep, unstratified deposits laying close to the surface of the earth. You see an example here of the teal. And you can't explain these by ordinary geological processes unless they were just dumped there by the flood. So that was one of the evidence for believing in this flood. Another were the animals that we were talking about just a minute ago. Their bones are found in these diluvian deposits, but then they go extinct, and a flood would explain their distinction. And you see there at the lower left is a woolly mammoth. They're still finding these frozen animals up in Siberia. And then in North America at this time period, you had the camel and the horses. But when the European explorers got here, there was no evidence of them. So they had went extinct. So there was extinctions on all continents, and these could be easily explained by the flood. Another, as I mentioned in the last lecture, was this rich topsoil in the Midwest and China and other places, and now the flood could explain how it all kind of got grouped together and sorted and dumped, and it has evidence of being laid down by water deposits. That was more evidence of flood. Today, they say these were windblown deposits, but that there's no layers that would show that to be true. Another reason for believing in a recent flood were these wide U-shaped valleys, which could not have been cut by the V-shaped riverbanks. The rivers would just continue to cut an ever deeper channel, but it could not explain these wide U-shaped valleys. And then finally, and very important, we'll be talking about were these erratic rocks. These rocks laying near the surface, or say sometimes partially buried, sometimes actually, as you see here, above ground. And the geologists can identify their origin bedrock maybe 10 or 100 miles away, but what could have brought them to their present location? And there had to be some powerful, the only thing they could guess, a powerful stream of water, which they believed occurred as part of this flood. Now, one problem, though, I want to mention, the diluvian geologists did make some mistakes. First of all, they believed wrongly that the flood was caused by a shift in elevation between the continents and the ocean. I suppose they were looking for a source of water for the floods, actually, this water, according to the Bible and the truth, the water actually came from inside the continents. But then it was deposited in the oceans and widened the oceans and made them deeper. But the flood wasn't caused by a shift as they believed. And then they believed at the time of the flood that the mankind had not spread out of the lands of the Bible. In fact, they did find evidence of man in the diluvian, but they wouldn't accept it. They said this had to have been intrusion from later times. And this would come to figure in the fact that how mankind is now believed to be so ancient. If they accepted at the time, it'd be evidence of this being the flood. But they suppose that all remains of man date from after the flood. I just wanted to limit the flood and the Bible to the lands of the Bible, not to Europe and America. Well, one of the reasons that they thought like this is archaeology was associated, I'll be mentioning a little bit, it was associated with history, the humanities, and the Bible. And here you see on the right this prehistoric house. It's actually a house that was buried by the flood, but they just compartmentalized that away from the geology. You see on the left. And just, they didn't want archaeology to be a part of the science. And at this time, the only archaeology that existed was mostly concerning the ruins of ancient Rome and Greece, and maybe they were getting into Egypt and a little bit into Mesopotamia at that time, but they were completely separate disciplines. Otherwise, they would have recognized all these prehistoric graves as being flood burials, which apparently no one did. I wrote this book in 2011. I made a search. I didn't know. And then I saw, well, sure enough, you got all these prehistoric ruins. The pyramids were actually built before the flood, remodeled later. You see, and up on the hills, these ruins appear near the top of the ground. In lower levels, they're covered up, and you see an example here of this man with a beer beaker and a knife, very fitting the world before the flood, the violent and corrupt world before the flood. And you see he's in this position that's not a normal a burial position, but the flex position indicates he dies by drowning. It's just so obviously that all these prehistoric graves are coming from before the flood. Now, another problem they had concerned was the two-book view of God's revelation that was famously associated with Francis Bacon. Now, on the surface, this seems like something that we would all believe in. Bacon talked about the Bible is a book of God's words, but science is a book of God's works, the creation. But he did not want science. He wanted science to interpret the Bible, but he didn't want the Bible to interpret science. And of course, they had the problem with Galileo that ran into. The Bible can get interpreted correctly and cause a problem for science. Well, so I mean, there's all types of mistakes made in science. You can make them by wrongly interpreting the Bible. You can, it can go both ways. But in this case, science, with this Baconian compromise, science became the master when it comes to creation of the Bible. It's sometimes called the Baconian compromise. Now, it's also it went along with the notion of keeping the Bible, the science, the Bible's assigned to history and the humanities, and it should be separate from science. Now, history, it begins with the Bible. But science begins with the Greeks. It's only been gradually, and this has really been from the earliest time of Christianity. I mentioned Thomas Aquinas. It was also true to a great extent with some of the early church fathers. But science really, the Bible started getting into science mainly around the time of the Reformation, and it really was the cause of science. The beginnings of historical science, as I'll be showing you. So the Bible has really been truly important in giving a true picture of the world because it's the only account of history that we have. But at the time, even after the Reformation, the period called Enlightenment, the 18th century, science is still based on Plato, Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas, Neoplatonism, and Harvard professor Arthur Lovejoy wrote famously his book on the Great Chain of Being, showed how science at this time was based on this hierarchy between maybe God on the top and angels and man, and then animals, and then plants, and then minerals. In fact, science was mainly a classification. The minerals, different kinds of rocks, different kinds of plants. They're exploring the earth during the 18th century, the European explorers, by classifying all kinds of animals. And basically, science begins as classification, but it lacked natural history because it lacked really the light of the Bible. Actually, when you bring the Bible in, you get some natural history. Now, Nicholas Steno, the Danish naturalist, he is still regarded as the founder of empirical geology. You see down at the bottom, he explained the concept of the rocks, the layers being laid down in the more recent layers near the top. We saw that in the geological column. In the upper right-hand corner, you see a shark teeth, which he said, well, I mean, there was a time, were these just sports of nature, these petrified fossils? And the Aristotelians, they believed that was, there were just different kind of rocks. The fossils were just different kind of rocks. But Steno, because he believed they were laid down by Noah's flood, he suggested that they had once been living animals. So he may have been wrong about a lot of this, but it's really advancing science because it's allowing the understanding of fossils is now being seen as from due to the Bible from animals. And of course, at the time, the scientific consensus was that the world had only been around 6,000 years. So that was not regarded as a problem at the time. But very important, Steno is still celebrated even by secular scientists today because this is his contribution. Now, here's a very famous William Paley, a very famous apologist. He wrote this book, Evidences of Christianity, showing the problems with David Hume's skepticism and defending the books of the Bible. But he also wrote separately about nature. He famously is associated with, said, if you were walking in the woods and you find this watch, you're not going to say, "Oh, nature created this." No, there had to be, there had to be a human intelligence behind this watch, and this would be what we now call intelligent design. And he was a favorite of these scientists I'm going to be talking about, like Lyell and Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was in the beginning. They loved these, uh, but my point here is the Bible and history is still separated from science. But with that watch, this at the time, the industrial progress is being made, and explanation of electricity and magnetism, and especially mechanics. There was a view that the world could be explained mechanistically. Uh, you introduce time, but you don't have history. You don't have a direction. But this mechanistic worldview also led to the challenge of miracles and to the skepticism that would influence the Enlightenment. Uh, Very important, intelligent design, even though ordinary Christians, we believe in it, but it also encourages deism. For example, Voltaire, he loved, the reason is you could develop a theology without referring to the Bible. And but of course, the deists, they believe that God created things, but they believe God created things just like they are. And I mentioned in the last lecture about James Hutton, who was a deist, and he rejected the biblical account of the earth and the history of the flood, or the miraculous account. And he proposed this machine-like explanation of the world, called uniformitarian. Said the earth reveals, famously, he said, has no evidence of beginning, no vestiges of beginning, no prospects of end. The earth functions forever like a machine. And he would be very important in this, moving the belief, geological belief in the flood, to explaining away that. And the man who began to explain away the Diluvian flood was a disciple of he originally was a disciple of William Buckland. He believed in the flood, but then he um, he 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 wanted to explain away this by using Hutton's theory of what's called uniformitarianism. And of course, Lyell is also famous. He was the mentor of Charles Darwin, and he used Hutton's diluvium flood. Uniformitarian science to explain away the flood, as and famously in this book called The Principles of Geology, published between 1830 and 1833. And this represents the first shift away from the belief in this recent the diluvian flood. And on the frontispiece of this book, you see these temples of Ceres. Is in Naples, Italy, and there are these Roman columns, and about halfway up these columns, are barnacle incrustations. Now, that's an indication, Lyle was pointing out, that the ocean or the water had arisen up on these columns to quite a ways, and then has receded back down since the time of the Romans. So he's indicating, well, the world is changing. You remember we talked about the shift between the continents and the oceans that the geologists believed in, but he believed it was very slow. Yeah, it was a flood, okay, but it was a very slow flood. Now, he also, the key is in explaining the way miracles is to find some gradual process that would do this away. He also used the theories of the Scottish Presbyterian Reverend John Fleming. And Fleming, he didn't want to mix science and the Bible again, but he said these animals disappeared by hunters. This is an example you're looking at of a giant elk. And one of these giant elks was found with the bones in this diluvium deposits with an injury indicated that a human hunter had killed these. And he said, well, just like the wolves had been eliminated from England in his time, he said these other animals had been eliminated by gradually eliminated by human hunters. And But the way he explained these deposits, these diluvium deposits, like these big rocks, he believed that the shift in elevation between the oceans and the land, when also was a change in temperature, and these rock these diluvium deposits were really once at the bottom of the ocean, and they got frozen together. But then, as the oceans rose, they became icebergs, and the icebergs drifted over land and deposited these. Now, this is, it's just absolutely fantastic. But believe it or not, his student Darwin believed it. A few other geologists believed it. It was called the drift theory, and it became a very popular. In fact, the name of what's now called ice was referred to as drift. So that was the first step Lyell took in explaining away the flood deposits as gradual, non-miraculous deposits. Then, but the important thing, it vastly expanded the area of these deposits. Now, if this was the world before the flood, everything concerning the man and even these animals, it was maybe a few thousand years. But when you change this to the slow processes, Lyell expanded this to several hundred thousands of years. That was his guess. Now this has been stretched on to several million years. But explaining things gradually explained away the miracles. That was hard to believe, but soon following that came the theory that these boulders, you see them on top of these glaciers, had been moved by glaciers, and it was what we refer to as the Ice Age. So you're seeing right now how the evidence of floods getting changed to Ice Age, very famously pioneered by Louis Agassiz, a Swiss. His expertise was in fossil fish, so he already had a big name when he proposed that glaciers had once covered much of Europe. And he was very important. Buckland, who had been the main proponent of the biblical flood, was responsible for these deposits. He could not support his student Charles Lyell's view about these icebergs doing this, but he did support Louis Agassiz. But both of them are very important. They had found these glaciers. They had found these deposits. Buckland had found these deposits in Asia and in Alaska and in Australia. So he's finding them all over the world. Louis Agassiz, after he moved from Switzerland to America and became a professor, a very influential professor at Harvard University, he went to the Amazon rainforest and found these glacier deposits in the Amazon. So the two of them are proposing what was called snowball Earth. Here was a time when the Earth was just completely covered by glaciers. This was too much even for Lyell and Darwin, so they held to their drift theory rather than, both of these theories are just truly fantastic. But this is the actual history of the science. Now, they had the good fortune as the explorers were going out. The explorers discovered that Greenland, there were these giant glacier sheets in Greenland, and a short time later they found them in Antarctica. So this allowed them to see, well, the whole Earth wasn't covered by glaciers, but only part of the Earth. And you see here the current ice age theory. It's limiting these glaciers um, to New York State and coming down in the Midwest a little further, but not where I live in North Carolina. The only problem is, and of course, the Lubin and Agassi knew this. You got them in North Carolina. Here you see me standing beside some of these. Now, the geologists cannot. Well, their official explanation is these were uh, were uh, were deposited by the ice age. The problem is North Carolina is far south of the southern limits of the ice age, and then but the other problem is it's impossible for these rocks to have been moved by glaciers. Now, Charles Lyell um, was a lawyer. William Buckland was a minister, ordained minister, and Agassiz was a doctor. They are obviously were not engineers. It's very easily. In fact, I've got the best books by glacier scientists how these rocks, but they're they're it's impossible. We'll have a little fun. I'll have a future lecture on these erratics, and I'll show you clearly that glaciers cannot move. In fact, they had these glaciers moving along level land. The only thing that could really move glaciers would be gravity when you see them in the mountains. But not only ground, they have them even going over these mountains to come up into New York State. So it's really a fantastic theory, yet it's being taught now. Now, but very important with this, you first come up with the scientific challenge of the Bible, which really changed Christianity, changed the world. First of all, what they've done, they've explained away the geological evidence of Noah's flood. Then they, by making this appear to be gradual, they push back the era of this period from about 6,000 to hundreds of thousands of years. And only after making this shift would they recognize that there were human artifacts or human remains in these deposits. Now, they didn't want to accept them because that would be an indication, at this time especially, Lyle didn't want it because it would be an indication that these were from the flood. But after they've eliminated the flood, they've got this long period. When they accepted they existed, that ended up in pushing back the antiquity of man. Interesting, Lyle was behind the official recognition of this in 1859, which also happened to be the same year as his student Darwin published The Origin of the Species. Now, these were completely unrelated, but the truth is, this pushing back the antiquity of man was and remains the greatest scientific challenge of the Bible. It also, of course, made it possible for Darwin to write a few years later his Descent of Man, proposing human evolution. But it would have been impossible if mankind had not been on the earth more than about 6 to 10,000 years. Now, the real thing that's driving this is theologians, everybody, it's the Industrial Revolution, the second. Science is replacing natural theology and what was formerly called natural theology and natural philosophy. Theologians fall in love with science. They still, you'll still see theologians more impressed with science than somebody that's had really practice with science. And if you have a lot of practice with science, you're going to be skeptical. But they just buy this wholesale. Of course, it changes the church, it changes the nation, changes the world. You see here, though, the way they did this is gradualism. Miracles are explained away by some gradualists. Sometimes it's called uniformitarianism, but it wasn't. There was a direction to it. It was gradualism is the best explanation. But then science, before this, natural theology and natural philosophy, you had to know everything because everything is related. You really need. But then the notion of geology became a specialized science. They would not allow scriptural, they would not allow you to use Bible in science in these new scientific society. So it became science became professionalized scientific societies. Christians, of course, they still believe in, but they shift to believing in a local flood at this time. Uh, but this sort of enabled the higher criticism, which also rejected miracles, to be introduced. It began in Germany, but it did not spread in the English-speaking world, where the churches were still very much involved with science, like in the case of Buckland. Uh, but the higher criticism comes in the English-speaking world. And then immediately, even before Darwin, but especially with Darwin, you begin the science versus the Bible debate. So though science, though pioneered by ordained ministers, it becomes a secular profession. And scientists replace theologians as our secular world's priesthood. So you see the problem. Yeah, that question is, which is truly a book of myths? This book of the, now, of course, I'm not talking about the practical sciences. I'm talking about the historical sciences, things like the Ice Age and the Old Stone Age. And in future lectures, I will address these: how the evidence of man with extinct animals is actually the world, the antediluvian world, and why the Old Stone Age and also the New Stone Age. The Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic, corresponds to the Ice Age or the Pleistocene era. But these are accepted even by creationists. These are fictional accounts of man. They're actually impossible as I explain in my book, for man to have lived so long. But also, I address in my books, and I'll do in a future later, how scientific dating. Now, you had this narrative of the Ice Age about 100 years before scientific age, radiocarbon began. But I will explain how the scientific dating will always conform to the scientific narrative, except it will keep pushing back beginnings, because there's where the money is, there's where the excitement is, the ever earlier dates. But it has made the scientific explanation of the ancient world, it is so complicated and bonkers. The only way to deal with it is throw it away and use this light of the scriptures. Also, of course, explaining why the prehistoric graves are not religious burials, but were actually created by the flood. But in distinction from these earlier flood geologists, I'll explain how the waters of the flood actually came from inside the earth, though they did drain in the oceans, making the oceans wider and actually deepening them. And that process is still happening today. But very important, these big rocks I showed you, as some of the early geologists had figured out, the only way these could possibly have been moved if it was from a very powerful stream of water had actually been responsible for moving these. And I'll explain how in fact the water and I'll explain how much water is still existing inside the earth. So just as the Bible said, they came from springs of the deep. And finally, and most important, why mankind has been on the earth no more than about 6,000 years. So thank you for listening to this this current lecture on Noah's Ark and scripture science.